What is up, my friends and fellow busy bees? Today I'm bringing you 5 furniture flipping hacks from the vault. We're going to talk all about the magic of mineral spirits, getting a flawless stencil, dealing with pesky drips, extending screws that may be a little bit too short, and creating molds out of nothing to replace ornate details on your pieces. I like to do these little episodes that are filled with just some quick, tangible tips every now and then as little helpful hacks that you can integrate into your day-to-day furniture makeovers. They're things that I've picked up along the way. Whenever I know where I got it from, I try to give credit to the creator who taught me this, but the reality is social media is so flooded with this stuff now that I kind of just pick them up as I see them throughout the day and I add it to my vault. So if you know that you have shared this tip and you think that I may have seen it, I do apologize. But also, you probably learned it from someone else, so it's all in the spirit of sharing knowledge and helping others to improve in their furniture flipping journeys. So tip number 1, I learned years ago from Jess at Oak and Grain Refinishing, and it's how to deal with paint drips, because they happen to the best of us. Sometimes it has to do with the tool that we're using. Maybe you have a sprayer that's new to you and you're not used to the settings yet. Maybe you're using a roller or a brush and it was just a little bit overloaded with paint, or it's a thicker paint than you're used to, so you end up with a drip when you're painting a vertical surface. If you see this happen, do not fret, and also don't try and fix it. Just leave it. If you have already gone past that part on the piece that you're painting, don't go back and try and fix it because you're just going to create more of a mess. Acknowledge the drip, add it to your to-do list moving forward, and just keep painting the piece, and then return once it's fully dried. You're going to grab a razor blade and some sort of sanding block or sandpaper, and you're going to use that razor blade safely, carefully, to slice the raised part of the drip off. So you're going to hold that parallel to the piece that's vertical and slice off anything that is raised above that flat surface using the razor blade. And then you'll essentially have like a bit of a crater where that drip was, and you're just going to use your sandpaper or sanding sponge to lightly sand that area until it is smooth. You might have to use a little bit of a lower sandpaper grit and then use a little bit of a higher one to smooth it out fully, because you don't want to feel any sort of bump or edge where that drip was. You want it to be perfectly integrated, so then when you go in with the next layer of paint, you won't even notice that it was there. Quick, easy, doesn't have to be dramatic, and it doesn't have to completely ruin that whole layer of paint that you tried to put on. I know for the perfectionists in us, it can be difficult not to go back and just perfect that in the moment, but if you just let it dry as is, it will make your life so much easier. Next up is the way to get a flawless stencil if you want to use that on your furniture piece, whether on the body of the piece itself, or sometimes I like to add a little stencil along this side of the outer edge of the drawer of furniture. Just a little bit of an unexpected pop, and not somewhere that you typically see any sort of design element added to a piece. So I find if I can find a stencil that works well for the look, the feel, the vibe, the style of the piece, then it can really go a long way. And so first step, of course, is to get the stencil on there. If it is not a sticky stencil, like a Redesign with Prima stick and style stencil roll, which are great, by the way, highly recommend those. Those are usually what I'll use because they are essentially a sticker that's just in a long roll, so you can put it on, you can place it, and it's on there really well and flat and sticky. But if it's not one that's sticky, you're going to want to tape that stencil in place so it's not moving around at all and you don't have to hold it while you are using it. I find it much easier to tape it down. And a lot of the times with stencils, especially when you're first using them, you'll see bleed through around the edges because of a couple different issues. Number 1 is trying to get it nice and opaque too quickly, so putting too much product on at once, as well as using the wrong or the unideal tool to get it on there, because if you're going to be painting with a paintbrush or something, you're going to be having to do sweeping motions, which will allow the product to get underneath that stencil a lot more easily and bleed through. Instead, use a foam dabber. You can get these at like craft stores, and it's essentially like a little wooden stick with a foam dabber. It's like a little thimble kind of looking thing on the end of it, and it just has a flat surface so that you can get a really small amount of product on there. Dab off the excess on a piece of paper or the back of your hand, whatever, and then dab up and down on that stencil. And it's not going to be opaque right away. You're going to have to do a few different coats of this to get it really opaque and looking good, but that's the way that you really get those crisp lines, because you're not putting too much product on there at once, and you're just dabbing it up and down versus doing that swiping motion back and forth like I mentioned. That ends up often with the product slipping around a lot. If you have a color that is underneath the piece as well, so say you're working on a painted dresser, it's all painted one solid color, but then you're going to do a stencil with another color on top of it, it's also a good idea to do the first coat in the base color of that full body, because that will then give it like more of a base underneath in case there is any bleed through, and then go in with the color that you actually want the stencil to be. But I find using the dabber method has worked 10 times out of 10 for me. I've never had any issues when I have done this, but in the past when I've used a paintbrush and I've just tried to like swipe it on there really quickly, it's gotten the job done more efficiently, but of lesser quality. So for me, that's not worthwhile. I want it to look as good as it can. So I can be really efficient with it with the stick and style stencil rules, because I can get the full length of it on there. I can go through and get a really good layer on, let it dry completely, and then go through and do typically 2 to 3 is enough to get it nice and opaque, probably 3 for the most part. But it's not like a small stencil that I'm having to then replicate that design a bunch of times on the piece. I can just have it all on there at once, if that makes sense. And if you do have a smaller stencil that you then need to move once it's nice and opaque, make sure that you either clean off the stencil or wait until the paint has thoroughly dried on it, because sometimes, like I said, the product can get in there and it can slip around, and if there's any paint on the underside of that stencil and then you put it down on the fresh part of the piece where you're going to put some more stencil down, it's going to get messy underneath. So make sure that it's either clean or thoroughly dried before you move it around. The next tip I learned from Karen at Designs by Karen, and it is a hack for if you have screws for new hardware on your piece that are too short for the piece that you're trying to put it on. So maybe the drawer front is a little thicker than average, maybe it's an extra thick door on a cabinet, for example. And if you listen to previous episodes, you know that if it also came with breakaway screws, that you may be able to just do that and it won't be a big issue. However, if all you have are those ones that came and it's too short and you don't have a hardware stash of screws like I've also mentioned you should keep, then this is what you can do. So you're going to take the head of the screw, so where you would put the screwdriver in to screw it in, and you're going to measure out and see the diameter of that and match that up with a drill bit of the same diameter or width or thickness, whatever you want to call it. And then once you find that drill bit, you're going to screw just a little bit into the back of the hole for where you would put the hardware in. So where you would insert the screw, so the back of the door of the cabinet, the inside of the drawer front, you're going to use that drill bit to screw in just a little bit so that that screw head can sit into the hole and sink in to give you just a little bit of extra leeway and make the screw have the appearance of being a little bit longer than it actually is. If you just need that little bit of length to get it to go through so that the hardware can latch on and tighten up. When you're doing this, make sure that you're careful to hold the drill bit level when you're drilling in, or else it could get funky and the hardware may not sit perfectly level or anything like that. So go slow and be cautious when you're doing this, but if those screws are just a little bit too short, this can really help you in a pinch and save you a trip to the hardware store. Now, for those that don't know, let's talk about some mineral spirits magic, because this is a product that I actually didn't use for probably the first at least year of doing my furniture makeovers. It was just never something that I needed to purchase. I wasn't using it to clean up any oil-based products because I would often just throw out any tools that I would use. For example, if I had an oil-based top coat or if I was using a shellac-based primer or anything that called for mineral spirits to be used during cleanup, I would just toss it because I was buying inexpensive products in order to just toss it. However, at one point in time, I figured I needed to pick it up, so I did grab it, and since then, I've realized all the different uses that mineral spirits has, and I wish I knew about it a little bit sooner. So one of the great uses is that it can remove a wax finish from an old piece. So if you pick up a piece that has an old wax finish over maybe a chalk paint or just over raw wood that you want to remove in order to upcycle that piece, or if you have refinished a piece of furniture, you've added wax over it as the finish and it's not looking the way that you want it to, especially once you buff it out. And personally, I find that a wax finish, it doesn't always look great. Like 9 times out of 10, I don't love the look of it unless it's on raw wood, but over a painted finish especially, I just find it doesn't look as flawless as it could. That's just a personal opinion. Don't get offended if you use it for all of yours. I'm sure it looks better when you do it, but for me, it's just like not my favorite. So if ever you put it on, you want to give it a go and try it out, but then you're like, this isn't really what I thought it would be, you can remove that without impacting the paint underneath using mineral spirits. So just put it on a cloth, or if it needs something a little bit more gritty, you can use a really fine steel wool and use it to remove that wax finish. It's also a great product to use to clean off your pieces. So once you sand everything down and you want to get rid of any residue that may be there that you can't knock off with a brush from sanding, grab some mineral spirits on a shop cloth and wipe your piece down, and that will get rid of any of the sanding dust or residue. And you can use water or a damp cloth for this. However, if it's a wood piece, that's going to raise the grain of the wood. So if you use mineral spirits, because it's chemicals, it doesn't do that to the wood. So you're better off to use mineral spirits for this reason. Obviously, water is a little bit more free than mineral spirits. You don't need to use a lot though. It does have a really chemical smell, so make sure you're wearing a respirator. But that's going to even everything out, clean it up, and it won't raise that wood grain again, because if you're using water, a lot of the times, especially if it's really raw wood or a really porous wood like a pine, once you wipe that with water, it will look clean, but then if you touch it again, it's kind of like, not bumpy, but the grain is raised, so you're going to feel almost like you need to sand it flat again, and then it's kind of like a vicious circle. So mineral spirits can help to combat that. And it's also a great thing to use as a way to double check your work, because once you wipe that down with mineral spirits, that's essentially the color that the wood would look if you were to just add a top coat onto it without staining it. So that could be a really good way to assess where you're at, and as well to look and see if you missed any spots, whether you see any old finish that's still there, any spots that are a little bit darker that couldn't quite notice when it was sanded down and everything looks a little bit lighter and is covered in dust. Or you can see if there's any other residue, like maybe glue, if you had removed veneer, for example. It just gives you a clean slate to work off of and gives you a clear idea of where you're at. The last furniture flipping hack is for replacing trim or other ornate details on your pieces that may have either broken, been sanded down so much that they just look horrible at this point. I've come across that a lot. Or are just completely missing from wear and tear over the years. If you have drawer fronts or edges of pieces that have these ornate details, a lot of the time it's easy for them to get knocked off or get hit, and so a piece of it flies off, or maybe it just falls off because the glue gives out from over the years and the temperature changes and things like that. So if you come across a piece that you intend to paint and you want to fill in that missing spot, but you don't want to have to like mold it by hand. I mean, if you can do that, that's amazing, go for it. But some of these pieces I've seen, it would be pretty difficult for me with my very basic level of creativity and ability to do that. So a way that you can create a mold for this is to grab some hot glue. And now I'm going to say I have not tried this myself personally. I've seen a lot of people online do it, so I feel like it's doable, but I will say that my personal seal of approval isn't there, but I would like to share it because it would be really useful for other people to do. And there are kits out there to do this, but they're not super cheap. And if you just have a little tiny piece you're trying to fill in, I don't feel like you need to buy a big kit for that. I'm all about keeping it cheap. Same with the wood bleaching kits. For the most part, I think they're a bit of a ripoff. You can just use regular Clorox bleach or no-name bleach. For most woods, it's going to work fine, but that's a separate thing. We're talking about making molds. So take a hot glue gun and get some sort of lubricant to put over the piece that you're trying to replicate. Typically on these pieces, it will be the same design on either side of the drawer, or it'll be the same on one drawer as it is on another. So if there's a piece that looks about the same as the piece that would have fallen off, you're going to make a mold over that. But in order for the glue to not fully stick to that, you're going to want to lube it up a bit. So grab something like a coconut oil, Vaseline, something like that that's got a bit of grease to it, and lube up that area with just a light coating. And then you're going to get your hot glue gun, get it nice and hot, and you're essentially going to create a mold out of that hot glue over that portion of the piece. You can always trim it up later, so don't worry about making it too perfect in terms of the diameter or like the length of the mold and that kind of thing. But get that hot glue all over it. Maybe go left to right and let the hot glue drape over that area. Once you have it all fully covered, then work up to like kind of thicken the mold a little bit so it has some structural integrity when you go to pull it off. So if it means that you need to let that dry for a minute and then go back and put another layer on top of it, maybe do that a couple times till it's a little bit thicker. Then let it sit and cool thoroughly, and then go in and gently peel back that mold off of the details. It should come off pretty easily. You can maybe grab a little like razor blade or some other small scraper that you might have to help lift it off slowly and gently, because you don't want any of this to break off and you don't want the mold to break. But if you've lubed it up enough, it should come off fairly easily. And then you should be left with a concave mold of the detail that you're wanting to recreate for that spot somewhere else on the piece. So once it's all dried and off, you can then, if you need to kind of cut that down to make it the right length and width for the piece that you want to replicate. And then you're going to find something to fill that mold. I've seen people use an epoxy mix for this. So if you have that laying around, you can just mix up a very small portion of that. I've seen people use Bondo as well. You could also probably use something like a wood filler that is a little bit more wet, I guess. For example, I'm thinking like my Elmer's wood filler is a little bit more dry and it has kind of like a dry clay consistency versus my LePage wood filler. It's a little bit thinner, it kind of separates a bit once it sits for a while. So that one would probably work a little bit better than a little bit of a drier one, or like a quick wood may work, I guess. Depending how small the piece is and how ornate the details are, it may not be able to get into those little nooks and crannies quite as well as a liquid could. But I mean, you could try a couple different things if you want to see if things that you have on hand would work. But again, you're going to lube up the inside now of that mold so that the product will come out, and then put it in, apply it with a scraper or whatever you need to get it in there. And if you can, try and flatten out the surface of that on top, because the flatter it is, the easier it will be to then get it to adhere to the furniture piece later on. And then you're going to let it dry. And I would say let it dry like overnight. Because it's a mold, it's thicker than you're probably used to if you're using this product, like a wood filler, Bondo, epoxy. And you want to make sure that the whole thing is going to be dry and structurally sound when you go to take it out of the mold. So once you come back to it, again, just try and peel that mold back slowly, delicately, lightly, and you should be left with a mold that can perfectly replicate the piece that you made the mold out of it from. Depending what sort of material you used and how flat it was able to get, you may need to then go back and lightly sand the back of the mold so that it's flat, so that it can lay up against the drawer front or whatever it is that you want to adhere it to. And then once that is nice and dried, get your piece painted, or at least prepped and cleaned and dried, and then you can glue that onto the piece of furniture. I would recommend once you glue it to tape it in place or put some sort of clamp over it, something that's going to hold it nice and tight up against it. And again, let that sit overnight if you can, and then come back to it, paint over it, seal it up, and it should be good to go. And something you may not know about me, I love little motivational messages. They always get me fired up, and I keep a running list of ones that are especially catchy or speak to me in the Notes app on my phone. So I end every podcast episode with one that I've noted down over the years in hopes that you leave our time here each week feeling inspired, motivated, and ready to take on whatever comes your way this week. So this week's Mel's motivational message is from Christopher Robin. Always remember you are braver than you believe, stronger than you seem, and smarter than you think. So if you run into any hurdles in your furniture flipping journey along the way, don't get discouraged. Remember, you are smarter than you think. You can figure out a way to get around this thing. These pesky pieces of furniture will always throw us for an absolute ride. There are so many pieces that I have gotten frustrated over the years about, that I have been at a bit of a standstill with and been like, what am I even going to do? I just want to throw it out. Why did it even start trying to take on this project? It happens all the time. But instead of completely giving up on it, take a little break from it, go for a walk, whatever, work on something else in the meantime. And then I just kind of let myself think through that and be like, what are possible solutions for this thing? Like, what's the issue? What am I not able to surmount right now? And are there possible other creative solutions that I'm not thinking about? I'll turn to Google. I'll ask other furniture refinishers if they've seen something similar. I'll go to YouTube. I'll look for videos. I'll go to TikTok. There's so much information out there, and we are resourceful people. We're a resourceful being. We can figure it out. It can be frustrating in the moment and seem a little bit overwhelming, especially if you have a deadline or a date that you're aiming to have it completed by and you feel pressured in that way. But just take a step back and remember that you can figure it out. It's not a life or death situation. It's all gravy. Take a breather, take a break away from it, and come back refreshed and ready to tackle it tomorrow. And just try out one solution, stick to it, see it out fully, and then if that doesn't work, you can always take it back and try again. But try not to let yourself get overwhelmed and discouraged from moving forward or from finishing the piece, because ultimately it's when we can find these solutions and surmount these barriers that we get that real satisfaction of knowing that we were able to figure it out and that we were able to persevere through it. And that's what really builds our confidence and our self-assuredness, which is ultimately what I'm aiming to help you guys to do here within yourselves, within your furniture flipping abilities, within your business, and in your life more broadly. All right, that's it for now. I appreciate your time, and I will catch you guys next week.